All right, last week my goal was to thoroughly confuse you. I had two people to tell me that I thoroughly confused them, that they were still confused. I hope that you read James and read Galatians like I gave you the Sunday school homework to do. I would suggest that you read both of those books. I wouldn't read them together, okay? I wouldn't read them the same day. What I do is read like Galatians, read it in one sitting, okay? Next day, read James in one sitting. Then do it again. But don't read both books in one day, okay? And then read all the book in one sitting, all right? Now my goal is, and I know some of you already know, well, I know what you're going to say, but sometimes we know what we're going to say, but we don't know how to really do it, okay? And in other words, how do I present this? And that's the goal that I'm trying to achieve this. There is, and I will say, an apparent contradiction, but you have to know the audiences and the reasons why Paul and James are writing the way that they're writing. Okay, we already looked at this, some things. Remember, Paul, this is question time. Paul, in the book of Galatians, is writing, and the book of Romans, basically, are writing to what group of people, what sect of people, mainly? The Gentiles. Okay? All right, James is writing to a general what sector of people? The Jews. Okay? So, part of the interpreting of a book is, okay, I go to that book and I ask questions, right? Who wrote it? To whom was it written? Generally, the books in the Bible are addressed to a certain group of people. So, to whom was it written? What did it mean to those people that it was written to then? Okay? And what does it mean for us now? That's the question of the hour. And so let's start by laying this again out in Galatians. Just start there in Galatians 2. And let's start reading in verse 16. Knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but by the faith of Jesus Christ, even we have believed in Jesus Christ, and we might be justified by the faith of Christ, and not by works of the law. For by the works of the law shall no flesh be justified. Now, can Paul say that any more clearly than he did in that verse? He said it 3 times. Did you catch it? Not, in the first part, justified by works. Then it says that, and not by works of the law. And then at the very end, for by the works of the law, no flesh is justified. Okay? But if, while we seek to be justified by Christ, we ourselves are also found sinners, is therefore Christ the minister of sin? God forbid. Let it not be. That's what God forbid means. For if I build again the things which I destroyed, I make myself a transgressor. For I through the law am dead to the law, that I might live unto God. I am crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. I do not frustrate the grace of God. For if righteousness come by the law, then Christ is dead in vain. Basically what Paul's saying here, a man's not saved by works. And if we are saved by works, then Jesus' death on the cross didn't mean anything. That's what he just said. O foolish Galatians, who hath bewitched you that you should not obey the truth? This is the truth that they weren't getting in Galatia. That's where, and why did the Galatians, and this is a good question, now I've told you the answer, why were the Galatians at this point in time, after Paul went, remember when Paul first went to Galatia, they welcomed him with open arms. He started the church at Galatia, everything was going great. Paul left to go do other things, right? And when Paul left, what group of people came back to Galatia, to the church that Paul started? There was a group of people that came back knowing that Paul was teaching this new gospel, and they said, well, we're going to go back and do some follow-up work with these folks. And who was those group of people that came back into the church of Galatia and caused problems? No, not Peter, not the apostles. The Judaizers. The Judaizers came in, and now after the Judaizers came in, and knowing that then we had a group of elders that were going to come from Jerusalem to a church, that's when Peter got involved in it, okay? But he wasn't the one causing the problem. Peter's problem, he wasn't...
The Judaizers in there, and that's where Peter was trying to divide them.
Well, no, the elders were going to come from a visit from Jerusalem. Okay. And when those were coming and Peter knew it, that's when Peter went to the Gentiles that had gotten saved but yet hadn't gotten circumcised, saying, let's go get circumcised, because the elders were coming. When Paul found that out, he stood him face to face because there was a problem. And that's the reason he's writing Galatians. The whole reason he's writing Galatians is because of these Judaizers that were coming back in and said, look, all right, you can't go to heaven, you can't be saved, you can't be of God unless you get circumcised, unless you do these things of the church, unless you do this A, B, C, D, and E, right? And that's the reason Paul's writing this. So from verse 16 to where we read in verse 21, I don't know how many times he said it, but no flesh is justified by the works. It's by faith only, by faith. So he goes in chapter 3, remember chapter divisions are not, divine. And so he says, O foolish Galatians, who hath bewitched you that you should not obey the truth? What truth? The truth that Paul taught, not what these Judaizers were teaching. Before whose eyes Jesus Christ had been evidently set forth, crucified among you. This only would I have learned of you, received ye the Spirit by the works of the law or by the hearing of faith? He asked a question in verse 2. He says, received ye the Spirit by the works of the law or by the hearing of faith? Paul said, it's not by works of the law. It's by faith. Okay? So let's go on. Are you so foolish, having begun in the Spirit? Are ye now made perfect by the flesh? He says, okay, what sense does this make? If you're justified by faith, then how in the world is your works going to justify you? He says, if you're telling me you're justified by faith and faith alone, and that's what saved you, then how in the world is works going to figure into that? Don't make sense. He calls them foolish. Have you suffered so many things in vain? If it be yet in vain, he therefore that ministereth to you the Spirit and worketh miracles among you, doth he it by the works of the law or by the hearing of faith? He asked the same question. He, maybe a little bit of a different way. And then he goes in verse 7. Know ye therefore that they which are of faith, the same are the children of Abraham. That's what the Judaizers would do. If you want to be a child of Abraham, then you got to be circumcised like Abraham was. See? Works. Okay? Paul says, no, nay, that don't make sense. Okay? And now, with that in mind, let's go over to James, because that's what we're doing, is doing a comparative study. Paul is clear. He is clear. No flesh is justified by works. You can't be justified by works. It's by faith. Okay, James chapter 2. James chapter 2. And I'm going to start here reading in verse 20, okay? And then we're going to go down a little bit further, and then I may back up, okay? So just stick with my logic here. But verse 20 of James 2 says this, but wilt thou know, O vain man, that faith without works is dead? Okay? Then verse 21, he goes and says, was not Abraham our father justified by works when he had offered Isaac his son upon the altar? Question. Was not Abraham, how did he put it? Justified by works. But that's not what it says. It says by works. All right? Then he goes on, when he offered Isaac, his son, upon the altar. Now go down to verse 23. And the scripture was fulfilled, which saith, Abraham believed God, and it was imputed unto him for righteousness. And he was called the friend of God. Ye see then how that by works a man is justified, and not by faith only. Now, reading Galatians and reading this section in James, there seems to be an apparent issue. Because Paul, on multiple occasions in the verses that we read, no flesh is justified by works, but by faith. Right? He says that, and then he asks questions multiple times about it. James uses Abraham as an example to use this. So, one thing that's curious and interesting to me is that neither Paul nor James defines the terms. Okay? They just speak the terms, but they don't define the terms. And we notice that in these passages that both Paul and James used Abraham as an example, didn't he? And that's kind of interesting. Both quoted from the same scripture in Genesis chapter 15. Paul uses it, James uses it, which says Abraham what? Believed God. All right? And it counted him for righteousness. But Paul said, that in chapter 2 of Galatians, verse 16, but Paul said that justification comes by faith alone of Christ and not by works of the law. But James says, by works a man is justified and not by faith only. James 2:24. So we got Galatians 2:16 and James 2:24 that say basically the opposite, don't they? Paul says, no flesh is justified by works, but by faith only. James says what? Man's justified by his works. So the question is, how do we rectify, or is there a rectification for this? Is there an answer for this? And the answer to it, yes. It's apparent. It's easy, but you have to understand the audiences and what they believed and how they believed. And then you got to understand that a writer is not going to stop and define something when he knows that the readers of that particular day already know what he's talking about. Okay? In other words, if you're reading a book today and an author uses an example or says something about society, he's not going to stop and define it because he's going to assume everybody reading it understands what he's saying. So Paul is of the mind that people in Galatia are understanding what he's saying. James is inclined that people reading his book is understanding what he's saying and what he means. Okay? So, but there are a lot of people that teach that, and I'm going to give you a little phrase that's going to sum all this up and going to make it all clear to you, believe it or not. Okay? It's that easy. But it's how you're thinking about it. Okay? And because no person is justified by works, but by faith alone in Christ, Paul. But James says a man's justified by works. Wasn't Abraham justified by works? He even uses that example, right? But yet Paul uses the same example, said he believed in God and it was counted unto him for righteousness. So you got the contrary there, okay? So the two are summed up like this. Remember when we started last week, I told you above Galatians. I don't know how many of you did it, but if you didn't do it, you ain't going to remember it. It might be good. You say, well, that sounds good, preacher, and that was good. I'm going to always remember it. No, you won't. You'll forget it tomorrow, because I do. Okay? So you got to write it down. When you right above Galatians, remember I told you to write judicial justification. And above James, I told you to write evidential justification. Right? Both are talking about justification. Matter of fact, Paul talks about it in the book of Romans. And he's talking about it again in Galatians. And James is talking about justification as well. And so, I'm going to give you one little phrase. You might want to write this above James. Okay? Not in Galatians, but James. Well, you can write it in either place. Might want to put it both. Okay? A belief that behaves. A belief that behaves. Now, in a common man's description and understanding and definition of this, and now I want to back up in James and go to verses 17 and 18. Even so faith, if it hath not works, is dead, being alone. Yea, a man may say, thou hast faith. That's Galatians. You put a period right there, Galatians. I've got faith. I believe. Right? I'm a Christian. I'm saved. I'm justified. Okay? I go to church. Right? A man may say that he hath faith, and I have works. Look at me. Look what I'm doing. Look how I serve. Look what I give. Look what I say. Look how I dress. Look at all these things. Man may say he has faith and I have works. Show me thy faith without thy works. Let's stop right there. Show me thy faith without thy works. James is saying, you have faith. Show me your faith without your works. Y'all go ahead. It's impossible. You can't do it. There's no way. Because, you know, I look at Miss Rita, I look at Miss Lisa, I look at Brother David, I look at Brother Mike, I look at Brother David, and, I look at you. I mean, you look normal to me. But there's a lot of people out here that look normal to me, and they're lost as golf ball in hayfield. I don't know them. I don't know that. I can't look at them and say, "Oh boy, Miss Deborah, you a saint, boy." I know you know Jesus, you know, and I don't know you. Don't know your name. Don't know anything about you. Don't know where you're from. Don't know anything. I can't tell. Ain't no way in the world. It's impossible. So one may say, "I have faith," and then I have works. Show me thy faith without thy works. James says, and I tell you what I'll do. I'll show you my faith by my works. In other words, you don't know who I am and what I'm about, but you'll see what I do, and what I do tells you who I am. Okay? Now, it's a belief that behaves. Now, let's go back and define the terms and which came first, the chicken or the egg. Okay? You go up. Did faith happen first, then works, or did works, then faith? It depends on who you talk to. If you talk to our Assembly of God people, our friends, our charismatic friends, if you talk to our Free Will Baptist friends, if you talk to any other religion out there, Methodists do this. They don't know that they do it, but they do, because there are men in theology. And you know, is this. They say, you know, that person, how many times have you heard somebody say, Well, that person going to hell because look what they do. They're judging them what? By their works. That's what they're doing. Huh? That's correct. Because it goes back to those two terms. And that's good. Y'all talk to me. Because I want you to understand this. That goes back to those terms I gave you. Judicial versus evidential. Paul is writing Galatians from God's point of view. Guess what, Miss Jane? I can look at you. You a nice lady. But I don't know if you're lost, saved, or what. Well, I do. I know you're saved because you told me. But I don't know because, it's, like you said, it's impossible to me be able to look at you and tell. Right? But God can look at you and He sees the heart. He knows. That's where that word judicial comes in at. Paul is writing from a standpoint, how does God view your justification? God looks at your heart. He knows the decision you made without any works. You don't have to do one thing to be saved. You don't have to go out and do one good deed. In other words, a person can ask Christ to forgive them, be justified on their deathbed, and die 5 minutes later and go to heaven. Because you're justified, saved by faith. Yeah. And that goes back to the example of Abraham. Now, was Abraham saved? And that's where his salvation was proven, if that's not where he accepted it. But we don't know because we're not told. But was Abraham saved when he had Isaac all tied up and put on that altar up there and ready for the fire, and he was reared back and he was in action? The Bible tells us in Genesis 15 that he was not just going to, but he was in the very act of doing it. He was, I believe, and according to that passage, that the angel of God stopped Abraham in mid coming down with that knife to kill his son, because that's what God told him to do. He was on the way of doing it. So, was Abraham saved by that act? No. The Bible says that Abraham believed God. And that belief was accounted unto him for righteousness. Well, where does the act come in at? The act comes in that him willing to do it, and in the very act of doing it, and was going to carry it out, tells the world that reads it even in 2024 that Abraham believed God. He believed God told him. Now look, see, the promise goes back before Abraham, before this trip that they made to the mountain to sacrifice. Go back to the time when Abraham and Sarah were childless. That's where it starts. See, we want to separate the stories. We want to put Abraham sacrificing Isaac on the altar, and okay, that was years later, so the birth and all of that was another thing. They're tied together. And the way they're tied together is this. Remember when God told Abraham in Genesis 12, He says, out of thee, all of the families of the earth will be blessed. Out of thee, your descendants will outnumber the sand on the seashore. Abraham's laughing. He says, what descendants? I don't have any. I got a wife that's old and can't have a child. How in the world are we going to do it? We can't do this. This ain't going to work. But yet God promised him what? A descendant. God promised him, so to have a descendant, you can't just have any descendant. You've got to have a son. You've got to have a son to carry on the name. Okay? So Abraham says, good. In the Mosaic law, there was a way that a barren woman who hadn't had a child by law could have a child, and that was through a surrogate. Okay? So Abraham says, good God, I got this. I'm going to help you. And he says, so he went to Hagar, and which was Sarah's handmaid, and basically had a baby by her. Okay? Because under the law, it allowed it. Now, that wasn't what God wanted, but yet under the law, it was allowed. He wasn't waiting on God. He was doing it himself. So as a result of that, Ishmael was born. Okay? Put that over there in your pocket for a minute. We'll talk about Ishmael in a moment. Later, an angel visits them and says, well, Abraham, you're not as smart as you think you are. That the wife that you have, you know, she's going to have a baby. Well, how can she when she's old? When Sarah was told about it, she laughed. Remember? That's why they named him Isaac. Because Isaac means laughter. That's what it means. Yeah, you telling me 100 years old I'm going to have a baby. That's what you're telling me. Yeah, yeah, okay. Want to see this? Well, it happened. Because God promised him a seed. And when God promised him that seed, he provided that seed. Now, I'm going to pull Ishmael back out of the pocket just for a moment, just as a sideline, and that's exactly the reason that the Israelites are having trouble today, is because of the descendants of Ishmael versus the descendants of Isaac. You got the Ishmaelites, which are all the other Arabs, and the Isaacites, which are the Jews, and they're constant fighting all the time. Because what happened after the child Isaac was born? All of a sudden, Sarah didn't want to have a thing to do with Ishmael anymore. Bring me my baby boy, the boy I carried, the boy I love. Ishmael and Hagar go in the woods as far as I'm concerned. And that's exactly where they went. They went off to another land. Okay? So, but Abraham believed God was going to give him a seed. So he doubted there a little bit. Now Isaac born, he's being raised, and now this promised son, Isaac, God says, Abraham, I want you to take, and go back and read Genesis 15. It's clear. I want you to take your son, your only son, Isaac. He tells him that. Your son, your only son. And I want you to take him to the mountain. I want you to sacrifice him to me. Did Abraham doubt God? Not a bit. He got up the next day, he got everything, packed the mules, packed the horses, got Isaac, said, come on, son, we're going for a sacrifice. They go to the mountain. A servant goes with him, remember? I think his name was Gahani, if I remember right. A servant goes with him. They get to the mountain, down to the base. They got to go up the mountain a little bit. So Abraham getting everything off, putting it on the back of the son, putting it on his back. They fixed to trek up the mountain. He turned around and told his servant, he says, I want you to stay here. Me and the lad, we're going to go up to the mountain. And we will be back. We will be back. Abraham didn't have a clue how God was going to do it. But he just knew that Isaac was the promised child. And he knew he was the promised seed. And he knew that all the descendants were going to come out of Isaac. And somehow, if I was going to sacrifice him, then God must going to be performing a resurrection on the mountain that day. Because Isaac can't die. And if he does die, he's got to be resurrected. Or maybe something else is going to happen. I don't know what Abraham was thinking. He didn't tell us. So they go up the mountain. They get up there, they get everything fixed, they make a preparation. The son's helping the father like he would, and he don't have a clue what's going on, except when it gets time to get ready for the sacrifice, and there was no animal. And Isaac asked a question. Daddy, I see the wood. I see the altar. Where's the sacrifice? Did Abraham tell Isaac, well, son, sit down. Let me talk with you. You believe God, don't you? You love God, don't you? You know, yeah, Lord, Daddy used to raise me to believe God. Well, God told me to kill you. And so I'm going to have to kill you today. So I want you to hop up here on this altar, and I'm going to tie you up, and I'm going to slay you. Is that what Abraham told his son? That's not what he told him. What he told him, he says, son, the Lord will provide himself a sacrifice. The Lord will provide himself a sacrifice. And what happened was this, what? The ram caught in the thicket, right? And came in over there. So think about the act when going back to Abraham believed God and it was accounted unto him for righteousness. Abraham believed God. That's what saved him. Not the act of sacrificing his son. But the act of sacrificing his son proved that he believed God. So, works is not the cause of justification. The root cause of justification. Works is the result of justification. So anybody says, well, you got to work to show people you're saved. No, you don't. You don't have to work to be saved, but you're going to work because you are saved, and that's your proof to man that you are. That's evidence, evidential justification. Okay? Read it again, and we'll pick up there next time, okay?